In 2025, Africa made a decision that sent shockwaves through the global economy, one that shook the very foundations of U.S. agricultural dominance. For decades, Africa was seen as a market for American goods, importing massive quantities of U.S. soybeans to feed its growing population. But what if that story changed? What if Africa, once considered the world's economic backseat driver, suddenly took the wheel and said, "We're not waiting for permission anymore"? In a bold and unprecedented move, a coalition of African nations led by Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana made an announcement that stunned the West. They rejected $124 billion worth of U.S. soybeans. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a statement, a message to the world that Africa is no longer content with being a consumer of foreign products. It's becoming a global economic player, in charge of its own destiny, feeding itself and protecting its own industries. The moment Africa rejected American soybeans was more than a turning point in trade. It was the moment Africa decided to stop waiting for permission and to start building its future on its own terms. Before we dive deeper into this groundbreaking moment, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more stories about Africa's rise, its economic revolution, and how it's rewriting the global rulebook. Stay tuned. For decades, the United States has relied on agriculture as a cornerstone of its global power. From soybeans to corn, wheat, and cotton, American farms have fed the world, with the U.S. controlling much of the global food supply. Soybeans, in particular, have been a quiet weapon in this trade war. They've been used not only to feed livestock and power industries, but also as a tool for exerting influence over countries that depend on them. For years, African nations have been a key part of this dynamic. The U.S. flooded African markets with subsidized, genetically modified soybeans at prices local farmers couldn't compete with. The result was predictable. African farmers struggled to take root in their own land. Local soybean processing plants shut down, and Africa became more dependent on imports, particularly from the U.S. But in 2025, something unexpected happened. A group of African nations led by Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana decided to take a stand. They chose to say no to the flow of American soybeans. The decision wasn't announced with the fanfare of a press release or a high-profile summit. No, this shift happened quietly, without warning, but it reverberated around the globe. These nations, who had long been seen as markets for U.S. agriculture, chose to stop importing subsidized American soybeans. Instead, they decided to buy from within the continent, kickstarting the creation of a pan-African agricultural supply chain. They chose to invest in their own farmers, their own industries, and their own future. This decision wasn't just a shift in trade, it was a revolution. At first glance, it might have seemed like a small economic move, but it was anything but. By rejecting $124 billion in U.S. soybean exports, Africa sent a clear message. It was no longer content being the world's agricultural backseat driver. It was taking control. The move was more than just a response to the trade imbalance. It was a rejection of decades of economic subjugation. For too long, Africa had been at the mercy of U.S. policies that pushed cheap, subsidized products into its markets. Africa had been cast as a perpetual consumer, a place where U.S. surplus crops could be dumped without competition. But with this decision, Africa was taking back its power. The U.S. was blindsided. Farmers in the Midwest, who had long relied on Africa as a key market for their soybeans, were left in shock. The American agricultural lobby immediately began pushing Washington to respond. But Africa's move wasn't just economic, it was a political earthquake. The ripple effects began almost immediately. African nations backed by the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfTA, which facilitated regional trade, began redirecting their agricultural flow. Instead of U.S. soybeans, they chose to buy from local farmers and regional producers. This wasn't just about growing crops. It was about creating an entire agro-industrial ecosystem that would empower African nations, reduce reliance on foreign aid, and encourage local production and trade. But it wasn't just about soybeans. It was about sovereignty. Africa was no longer willing to sit passively in the global economic game. It wasn't about rejecting the West outright. It was about asserting independence, choosing what would serve the continent best, and reshaping the narrative. But what was Washington's response? Was this just an isolated trade dispute? Or did it signal something much larger? What does this mean for the future of U.S.-Africa relations and the global economy? Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the aftermath of Africa's bold move. The global reaction to Africa's decision was swift and intense. In Washington, the initial response was one of confusion. How could this have happened? For years, U.S. agricultural companies had viewed Africa as a vast, untapped market, a place to dump surplus crops and make significant profits. Africa's sudden rejection of $124 billion in American soybean exports was not just a blow to U.S. farmers, it was a strike at the heart of America's economic influence over Africa. The American agricultural lobby was in full panic mode. Lobbyists rushed to Washington, urging Congress to take immediate action. The White House, caught off guard, convened meetings with trade experts and agricultural leaders. How could such a dramatic shift in trade relations occur so suddenly? What would this mean for U.S. foreign policy, agricultural exports, and the broader economy? But as Washington scrambled to react, something remarkable was happening across Africa. The decision by Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana was not just about rejecting American soybeans. It was about asserting a new vision for the continent's economic future. Africa's leaders, under the banner of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfTA, were creating an economic bloc that could stand on its own, no longer beholden to foreign powers. Africa's agricultural revolution was already underway. Governments began investing in local farmers and agro-processing industries, building infrastructure and systems to ensure that Africa could feed itself. The African Development Bank provided vital financing to create a network of local processors and supply chains, reducing the continent's dependency on foreign imports. In just a few short months, local soy production in Nigeria and Kenya began to rise. The raw materials that were once shipped to the U.S. were now being processed into oil, animal feed, and biofuels locally. The export of raw materials was being replaced by the export of finished goods, marking a crucial step in Africa's journey towards self-sufficiency. On the world stage, the reaction was mixed. While the U.S. and its allies were left stunned, countries like China, India, and Brazil saw an opportunity. These nations had been watching Africa's growth closely and had already invested in African agricultural industries, offering machinery, seeds, and expertise to help improve local production. They didn't see Africa's decision as a threat, they saw it as a shift that aligned with their own interests. China, in particular, moved quickly to offer support for Africa's growing agro-industrial sector, seeing it as a key part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Brazil, once a competitor to the U.S. in agricultural exports, found itself in an unexpected position of partnership with Africa. Both nations were now working together to ensure that Africa could develop its own agro-processing capacity and become a reliable producer of high-quality food products. This cooperation marked a shift in the global balance of agricultural power, one that the U.S. had failed to anticipate. Meanwhile, Europe, long reliant on American soy imports, began to feel the effects of Africa's decision. European officials who had always viewed Africa as a supplier of raw materials began to shift their stance. They realized that they needed to build new trade relationships with Africa, not just for agricultural products, but for a range of other commodities as well. Africa's decision to block U.S. soybeans had forced Europe to rethink its entire trade strategy, and countries like France and Germany began forging new partnerships with African nations. But perhaps the most significant shift was in the way Africa viewed itself. For the first time in modern history, Africa wasn't just reacting to global forces, it was creating them. African leaders were no longer waiting for permission from the West. They were now setting the terms for their own future, and the world had to take notice. Washington, meanwhile, was left grappling with the loss of a key trade partner. U.S. farmers, once able to rely on Africa as a market for their goods, suddenly found themselves facing a new reality. Soybean prices plummeted as American farmers were forced to find new buyers for their crops. The U.S. government, having long used agricultural subsidies as a tool to support domestic farmers, now found itself in the uncomfortable position of trying to protect a market that was rapidly shrinking. Even the most well-funded lobbying efforts couldn't undo the damage that had been done. The U.S. wasn't the only one caught off guard. While Washington was scrambling, Africa was quietly building an economic ecosystem that could rival anything the U.S. had ever constructed. The question now wasn't how to recover from the $124 billion loss. It was how the U.S. would navigate a future where Africa was no longer the price taker, but the price setter. What would this mean for the future of global trade? And how would the U.S. respond? The consequences of Africa's decision to block $124 billion worth of U.S. soybean exports reverberated far beyond the soybean fields of Illinois. For years, the United States had relied on its agricultural dominance as one of its key levers in global trade. The U.S. soybean market, in particular, was vital not just for U.S. farmers, but for the entire global food supply chain. By cutting off this major outlet, Africa sent shockwaves through the global agricultural system, and the effects were felt almost immediately. In the U.S., the immediate economic fallout was clear. Soybean prices plummeted. The Midwest, which had relied heavily on exports to Africa, was left with an oversupply of soybeans. American farmers, already struggling with low prices and a stagnant market, saw the value of their crops tank. The U.S. government, long accustomed to using agricultural subsidies to support farmers, found itself scrambling to find new buyers for its surplus products. Lobbyists from the agricultural sector flooded Capitol Hill, demanding emergency relief measures. But it was too late, the damage was done. But the economic consequences for the U.S. were only the tip of the iceberg. The real issue wasn't just the loss of $124 billion in trade, it was the loss of influence. For decades, the U.S. had used its agricultural exports as a form of soft power. When you control food, you control people. For many developing nations, access to U.S. agricultural products, especially soybeans, meant dependency. In a world where food security is a critical issue, the U.S. had long used its agricultural exports to ensure that nations stayed within its economic orbit. Africa's rejection of U.S. soybeans was a powerful statement that this era was over. Across Africa, the reaction to the soybean rejection was one of empowerment. No longer did African nations have to rely on U.S. products to feed their populations. Instead, they began to invest heavily in local agriculture. The African Development Bank, along with other regional financial institutions, injected billions of dollars into developing local agricultural systems. Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa began focusing on increasing domestic production, not just to feed their own people, but to create a self-sustaining agricultural economy. Processing plants for soybeans and other crops began to rise, and African farmers started seeing real benefits from these investments. In Nigeria, for example, the government launched the Soy Independence Project, which aimed to cultivate 10 million hectares of high-yield soybeans. This was not just about increase to the quantity of crops, it was about creating an industry. Soybean oil processing plants, feed mills, and biofuel refineries were being built across the continent. Local production and processing were no longer just a dream, they were becoming a reality. Africa was starting to build an agro-industrial ecosystem that would reduce its reliance on foreign imports and create a new wave of economic growth. Meanwhile, local businesses and cooperatives were thriving. Small-scale farmers in countries like Kenya and Tanzania were able to tap into new agricultural technologies, improving crop yields through better irrigation systems and climate-resilient seeds. The continent was slowly but surely moving toward food self-sufficiency, and the ripple effects were profound. Local industries were flourishing, creating jobs and boosting regional economies. But the impact wasn't limited to Africa. The rejection of American soybeans marked the beginning of a broader shift in global trade patterns. Once Africa began prioritizing local production, other regions took note. Countries like Brazil, China, and India, which had long seen Africa as a market for their own agricultural products, now found themselves in a position to partner with Africa rather than compete with it. These countries recognized the growing potential of Africa's agricultural sector and began investing heavily in African agro-processing industries, providing the technology, machinery, and expertise needed to scale up production. For Europe, which had been reliant on American soy imports, the shift was also significant. European nations, particularly in the EU, began forging new trade partnerships with African nations. As Africa's agricultural sector began to boom, European countries saw an opportunity to build mutually beneficial relationships. Partnerships where Africa was no longer just a recipient of aid, but an equal trading partner. In just 2 years, Africa's soybean exports surged by 78%. The $124 billion loss for the U.S. was real, but the $420 billion loss in influence was far more significant. For the first time in modern history, Africa was dictating the terms of trade, and the world was beginning to adjust to this new reality. But what does this all mean for the future of the U.S.? Africa relationship. With Africa's agricultural independence, will the U.S. be able to maintain its foothold in global markets? Or is this the start of a new economic order? What will happen next as Africa continues to flex its growing economic muscle? As Africa's agricultural shift took shape, the global reaction was swift, and it wasn't limited to the U.S. The ripple effect of Africa's decision to block $124 billion in U.S. soybean exports reached across the globe, sparking new debates and a reassessment of trade dynamics. In Washington, the official response was muted. The U.S. government tried to downplay the significance of Africa's actions, referring to it as a temporary trade dispute. But beneath the surface, the situation was far more complex. For the first time, Africa was standing up to the U.S. in a way that could not be ignored. This wasn't a simple disagreement, it was a shift in power, one that threatened to undermine decades of U.S. influence over Africa. The U.S. tried to exert pressure. Diplomatic channels were flooded with requests for explanations, and the U.S. government initiated talks with African leaders, hoping to reverse the decision. But Africa had made its point. It wasn't just rejecting soybeans, it was rejecting a system that had long kept it dependent on foreign powers. Washington's response was an awkward mix of diplomatic restraint and behind-the-scenes panic. While officials publicly called for calm, lobbyists and agricultural industry leaders rushed to Congress, demanding that something be done to restore the status quo. But Africa had already moved on. It had decided to redefine its future, and the U.S. was now forced to accept that Africa was no longer a passive player in global trade. The continent's economic independence was no longer a theoretical ideat, it was a reality. The global community began to take note. Europe, which had long been dependent on U.S. agricultural imports, recognized that it needed to diversify its sources. European leaders, particularly from France and Germany, began seeking new trade agreements with Africa, knowing that the old order was crumbling. African nations, empowered by their new economic agency, began forging deals directly with European countries, bypassing the need for American middlemen. China and India also saw this shift as an opportunity. Both nations, having invested in Africa's agricultural and industrial infrastructure for years, quickly stepped up their support. China, already a major player in Africa's development, increased its investments in African agro-processing plants, helping to turn raw crops into finished products ready for export. India, too, began offering technology, expertise, and financial backing for African agricultural projects, reinforcing its role as a partner rather than a competitor to Africa's self-sufficiency. The world was beginning to realize that Africa was no longer a market waiting to be exploited. It was now a force to be reckoned with. The rejection of U.S. soybeans was a declaration of independence, an assertion that Africa's future would be shaped by Africans, not dictated by foreign powers. As Africa's power continues to grow, the question remains, how will the U.S. adapt to this new reality? Can Washington find a way to work with Africa as an equal partner, or will the old dynamics of power and influence continue to fade? The future of U.S.-Africa relations is being redefined before our eyes. Looking ahead, Africa's future in the global economy looks more promising than ever. In rejecting $124 billion in U.S. soybean exports, the continent not only made a powerful statement, but also laid the foundation for a new economic order, one that centers on self-sufficiency, local production, and intra-Africa cooperation. Africa's shift toward self-reliance is already paying dividends. With the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, acting as a key driver, African nations are now building robust trade networks across the continent. The focus is no longer just on importing goods, but on creating sustainable supply chains that empower local farmers, businesses, and industries. By prioritizing local production and local processing, African nations are starting to break free from the cycles of dependency that have held them back for decades. The expansion of the agro-industrial sector is just the beginning. Investments are flooding in from within Africa, as well as from international partners who recognize the potential of the continent. The African Development Bank continues to be a major catalyst, financing the development of infrastructure and the scaling up of local production capabilities. From processing plants to logistics networks, the continent is transforming into a self-sustaining economic powerhouse. In Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, governments are investing heavily in research and development to create high-yield, climate-resilient crops that are adapted to the African climate. These new agricultural technologies will ensure that Africa not only feeds itself but also becomes a significant exporter of food to other regions. The focus is on innovation, sustainability, and the creation of value-added products like soybean oil, animal feed, and biofuels. Meanwhile, as African agricultural output grows, so too does the continent's economic influence. Local farmers are not just producing food, they're participating in the creation of a new agricultural economy. Cooperatives, empowered by access to financing and technology, are rising up as key players in the global food system. Countries like Nigeria are positioning themselves as leaders in the agro-processing space, with local mills and refineries creating high-quality products for both regional and international markets. The rise of digital platforms and smart farming technologies is also making an impact. From drone-assisted crop monitoring in Mali to AI-powered irrigation systems in Tanzania, Africa is embracing the tools of the future to boost productivity and increase efficiency. The continent is quickly becoming a hub for agricultural innovation, attracting talent and investments from around the world. Yet, the road ahead is not without its challenges. Africa must continue to build its infrastructure, improve access to financing for small farmers, and tackle the challenges posed by climate change. But the foundations have been laid, and the momentum is undeniable. As Africa moves forward, the world will be watching. Will the continent continue to build its economic muscle? Or will external pressures, diplomatic, economic, or otherwise, force Africa to reconsider its new path? One thing is certain: Africa's rise is inevitable, and the global balance of power is shifting. The story of Africa's rejection of $124 billion worth of USS soybean exports is more than just a trade dispute. It's a pivotal moment in history. It marks the beginning of Africa's journey toward economic independence, self-sufficiency, and global economic influence. For too long, the continent has been cast as a passive player in global trade, dependent on foreign aid and reliant on imports. But now, Africa is writing its own story, one where it dictates the terms, shapes its own future, and controls its own economic destiny. Africa's decision to block American soybeans was a turning point, but it's only the beginning. The continent is not only looking inward, but also seeking to connect with the world on its own terms. By focusing on local production, processing, and trade, Africa is building a sustainable economic system that will continue to grow and evolve over the coming decades. Through the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfTA, nations are coming together to create a more integrated, self-reliant market that benefits everyone. For the United States, this shift is unsettling. For years, it has relied on agricultural exports as a tool of influence, using its food exports as a means of control. But as Africa steps into its own, Washington faces a future where it is no longer the dominant player. The loss of $124 billion in soybean exports is just the start. The true loss is influence. Africa is no longer a market to be exploited. It is now a partner in shaping the future of global trade. The ripple effects of Africa's economic rise are already being felt across the globe. Nations like China, India, and Brazil are working with Africa, not as competitors, but as partners in building a new economic order. Europe, too, is beginning to shift its approach to trade with Africa, recognizing the continent's growing importance. Africa is no longer waiting for permission to prosper. It is taking control of its future and reimagining what it means to be a player on the global stage. The world is watching as Africa rises. What do you think about this historic shift? Is Africa's economic independence the beginning of a new world order, or just a fleeting moment in the global economy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more insights into Africa's journey and its growing role in shaping the future of global trade.